At the time, I had just moved to a small town in California for work. It wasn't really a town you'd see on a map unless you zoomed in pretty far. The kind of place surrounded by forest, where people mostly know each other, and the nearest real city is an hour away. It was also only about 30 minutes from Yosemite National Park, which meant a lot of tourists passed through during the summer. But outside of tourist season, the area was quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. I was renting half of an old duplex at the edge of town. It was cheap, which was the main reason I took it. The house was old wood siding, creaky floors, and a shared backyard with a fence that didn't really separate anything. The other half of the duplex was already occupied when I moved in. The guy living there was probably in his early 40s. Tall, thin, short, dark hair. I only spoke to him a couple of times during the first few weeks I lived there. Mostly just quick nods or a hey when we happened to be outside at the same time. He kept to himself. At first I didn't think anything about that. A lot of people in rural places are like that. But after living there a while, I started noticing a few small things that felt off. The first thing was his schedule. He drove an old dark pickup truck that was always parked on the gravel beside his half of the house. During the day I rarely saw him, but late at night, sometimes between 1 and 3 in the morning, I'd hear that truck start up. I noticed it because my bedroom window faced the driveway. The engine would start, idle for a moment, then he'd drive off toward the main road that led out toward the forests. At first, I figured he worked some kind of night job, but then I started noticing that sometimes he wouldn't come back until just before sunrise. One night, I happened to be up late watching something on my laptop when I heard the truck pull back into the driveway around 5 in the morning. I glanced out the window as he got out. He looked tired, not just sleepy, but physically worn out, like he'd been doing something strenuous. Again, not enough to mean anything, just a small detail. A couple days later, I noticed something else. He was unloading something from the back of the truck. There was a large shape in the bed of the pickup covered with a dark tarp. The tarp had been tied down with cords, but one corner had come loose and was flapping slightly in the wind. I couldn't see what was underneath it, but I remember thinking it looked bulky. I was sitting on my couch one evening with the local TV news on in the background when the anchor started talking about a missing person case. A woman had disappeared while driving between 2 towns not far from where we lived. The story said authorities were investigating the possibility of foul play. At the time, it just sounded like another sad local story. But over the next couple of weeks, more reports started appearing. Another person went missing, then another, all within about a 50-mile area. The news eventually started using the phrase possible serial offender. That was the first time it really caught my attention. A few nights later, I was watching the news again when they showed something that made my stomach sink a little. Police had released a composite sketch of a possible suspect based on a witness description. They showed the drawing on screen for maybe 10 seconds, and something about it looked strangely familiar. I stared at the TV longer than I probably should have. The man in the sketch wasn't identical to my neighbor, but the resemblance was enough to make me uneasy. I remember actually shaking my head and laughing quietly to myself. People resemble sketches all the time. That didn't mean anything. Still, after seeing that drawing, I couldn't stop noticing things. A couple nights later, I heard the neighbor's truck leave again around 2 in the morning. I looked out the window as he backed down the driveway, and that uneasy feeling came back. One afternoon, not long after that, I was coming home from work when I saw him standing outside his truck. He was closing the tailgate. For a second, I noticed something on the metal edge of the truck bed. Dark spots. They could have been dirt or rust, but in that moment my brain immediately went somewhere darker. They looked like dried blood. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous, but the thought stuck with me. Around the same time, I noticed something else in the backyard. Behind his half of the house, there was a heavy metal door built into the ground that led to a basement or cellar. I hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now that I looked closer, the door was thick and secured with a large padlock. It looked unusually reinforced. Seeing that door made my imagination run even further. I started thinking about the news reports again, about the sketch, about the truck leaving at night. Eventually, the idea formed in my head that I couldn't shake. What if my neighbor was the person responsible for those disappearances? I told myself that was insane, but the thought kept coming back. Then one afternoon, something happened that pushed me over the edge. I came home early from work and saw the neighbor loading groceries into his truck. A few minutes later, he drove off toward town. I sat in my car for a long time in the driveway thinking. Part of me knew what I was considering was stupid, possibly illegal, definitely dangerous. But another part of me kept thinking about the people in the news stories. Eventually, I got out of the car. I walked over to his side of the duplex. The back door was unlocked. I stood there for at least a full minute debating with myself. Then I slowly opened it and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was how empty the place felt. There wasn't much furniture, just a couch, a small table, and a few shelves. Everything looked extremely clean. Almost too clean. My heart was pounding the whole time. I kept expecting to hear the truck pull back into the driveway. I moved toward the kitchen. That's when I saw a metal case sitting on the table. It looked like something you'd see in a medical office. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside were rows of surgical tools, scalpels, clamps, bone saws. Some of them had faint dark stains on the metal. My stomach dropped. In that moment, I was completely convinced I had just found proof that my neighbor was killing people. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and took a few quick pictures. Then I closed the case and walked out as fast as I could without running. The second I got in my car, I drove straight to the local police station. It took a while to explain everything without sounding completely paranoid. But once they saw the photos of the tools, the officers took it seriously. Within about an hour, 2 patrol cars drove back to the duplex with me. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw something that made my chest tighten. The neighbor's truck was parked outside again. He must have returned while I was gone. 2 officers approached him while another stayed with me. He looked confused more than anything as they started asking questions. Then they put him in handcuffs. After that, they began searching the house. They found the metal case exactly where I'd seen it. Then one of the officers noticed the heavy door in the backyard. They called for another unit before opening it. Watching them cut the lock off that door was one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. At that point, I was completely convinced they were about to uncover human bodies. The door finally opened. One officer stepped down into the basement, then another. There was a long pause. I heard one of them say something quietly to the other. Eventually, they called the rest of the officers over. Later, they let me see from the top of the stairs. The basement walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of skulls. Animal skulls, deer, coyotes, black bears. Some of them looked professionally cleaned and preserved. It looked less like a crime scene and more like a disturbing collection. One of the officers later explained that the man had apparently been illegally hunting animals from nearby protected land and keeping the skulls as trophies. The blood on the tools likely came from animals he had been processing. In other words, he wasn't a serial killer, at least not of people. They led him back up the stairs in handcuffs and walked him toward a patrol car. As they passed me, he stopped for a second and looked directly at me. His expression wasn't angry. If anything, he looked curious. His eyes moved slowly over my face, then he said something quietly. "You have a very nice skull shape." After that, they pushed him into the back of the car. The police told me later that most of the blood on the tools was probably animal blood. But every now and then I still think about the way he looked at my head when he said that, and how carefully he seemed to be studying it.